Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a text that, well, fundamentally reshaped our understanding of life on Earth. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. This isn't just some dusty old book. It's really a masterclass in observation and logical deduction.
Exactly. It's a foundational text, often boiled down into sound bites, but Darwin's original words, especially in the introduction and those early chapters, they offer surprising clarity and depth, even 160 years later.
Yeah, and our mission today is really to give you a genuine shortcut to Darwin's core arguments. We want you to grasp not just what he concluded, which many people sort of know,
Right.
but how he built this revolutionary theory, the meticulous evidence, the whole intellectual journey, and frankly, the bold questions he dared to ask. We'll explore, the spark of his idea, how he challenged the beliefs of his time, and the elegant mechanisms he proposed.
hmm We'll cover his groundbreaking insights on variation, that intense struggle for existence, and the astonishing power of natural selection, all while tackling the very real challenges and doubts his ideas faced. Get ready for some aha moments that might just change how you see every living thing around you.
Okay, let's unpack this. Darwin's intellectual journey really kicked off not in a quiet library, as you might imagine, but during his voyage on the HMS Beagle. What were those initial observations that first sort of ignited this huge idea?
Well, he said he was much struck with certain facts, things like the distinct patterns of animal and plant distribution across South America and the geological connections between ancient and modern species. These weren't just isolated curiosities for him. They hinted at that mystery of mysteries, the origin of species.
And this wasn't like a sudden flash of genius, was it? He spent years, decades, meticulously gathering evidence and refining his thoughts.
Oh, precisely. Darwin returned home, worked for 5 years, sketched out his initial conclusions, then pursued the subject steadily for 15 more years before publishing what he called this abstract of his larger work. He even felt he had to explain this long wait, writing that he gives these personal details just to show he had not been hasty.
Wow.
And he actually rushed it into publication, partly because Alfred Russel Wallace had independently arrived at very similar conclusions. That prompted a joint publication advised by Lyell and Hooker.
That level of dedication is just staggering. And he was incredibly self-aware, wasn't he? Admitting his abstract was necessarily imperfect and that, facts leading to conclusions directly opposite could probably be found.
Yes.
He believed a fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides. It's such a testament to his scientific rigor, knowing your ideas would shake the world, but still presenting them with that humility and transparency.
Absolutely. It speaks volumes about him as a scientist.
So what was the established wisdom at the time? What was the prevailing view that Darwin was, daring to challenge with these ideas?
The dominant view, held by most naturalists and even Darwin himself earlier on, was that each species has been independently created,
Yeah.
just sort of popped into existence as is. But his observations increasingly led him to see this conclusion as erroneous.
He wasn't just saying that's wrong. He was asking a much deeper question, wasn't he? Like, how the innumerable species inhabiting this world have been modified so as to acquire that perfection of structure and co-adaptation which most justly excites our admiration.
Exactly.
How did a woodpecker get its specialized beak and tongue and feet all perfectly adapted for digging under bark, if not through some, grand design or sudden creation?
And he used the mistletoe as an even more striking example. It relies on specific host trees, right? Its seeds are spread only by particular birds, and its reproduction absolutely requires certain insects for pollination. He called it preposterous to explain the structure of this parasite and its complex relationships just by blaming external conditions or of habit. These intricate connections demanded something more.
Right. It wasn't just climate. He also pushed back against ideas like the one from the author of The Vestiges of Creation, who kind of proposed this sudden, unexplained leap like a bird suddenly giving birth to a perfect woodpecker.
Yeah.
For Darwin, that was simply no explanation for these very precise co-adaptations.
Exactly. For him, it was crucial, of the highest importance, to gain a clear insight into the means of modification and co-adaptation. And for this vital insight, he found his best and safest clue in a very interesting place.
Which was?
A careful study of domesticated animals and of cultivated plants. Right under our noses, basically.
Ah, fascinating. Thinking about that intricate dance between a specific flower and its pollinator, Darwin forces us to ask how that perfect fit happened, not just marvel that it exists.
Yeah.
And his answers started right in our backyards and farmyards. So what did he actually learn from our familiar farm animals and garden plants.
Well, he noticed that domesticated varieties think different breeds of pigeons or types of apples they tend to vary much more than their wild relatives. He thought this greater variability was likely due to the less uniform conditions under human care compared to the strict pressures of nature.
And he noted these fascinating laws regulating variation, like how changes in one part of an animal can correlate with changes elsewhere. You mentioned cats with blue eyes often being deaf, or certain hairless dogs having bad teeth. It wasn't just random variation. There seemed to be underlying patterns.
And crucially, he saw the power of inheritance. Breeders fundamentally understood that, produces like, if even rare deviations like albinism showed up in both parent and child, it strongly suggested an inherited tendency, not just chance.
He also tackled that common argument people used against his ideas. The domestic varieties, if they escaped and ran wild, would always revert back to their original ancestral forms. But Darwin looked for evidence and found, well, not a shadow of evidence for this.
Yeah.
He pointed to breeds like cart horses and race horses that keep their distinct features over an almost infinite number of generations.
Right. And his deep dive into domestic pigeons was particularly revealing. He collected every breed he could get his hands on, and he said the diversity of the breeds is something astonishing. You had the English carrier with its crazy head wattles, the short-faced tumbler with the beak almost like a finch's. I mean, the variations were immense.
Wow.
Yet despite all these differences, he became fully convinced that the common opinion of naturalists is correct, that they all descended from one ancestor, the wild rock pigeon.
It's really remarkable, isn't it? How human intervention, often without any real scientific understanding of genetics back then, managed to sculpt such a huge array of forms from common ancestors. It basically created a living laboratory, letting him observe variation and inheritance in action.
Indeed. And he identified the key mechanism behind this astonishing diversity as man's power of accumulative selection.
Okay, so how did this accumulative selection actually work? He explained it pretty simply. Nature gives successive variations. Man adds them up in certain directions useful to him. He wasn't just speculating. He cited breeders who, within a single lifetime, had significantly modified breeds of cattle and sheep.
Yeah, and he mentioned a skilled pigeon breeder, Sir John Seabright, who claimed he could produce any given feather in 3 years, but getting a specific head and beak might take 6 years. It shows the power, but also the patience needed.
And this methodical selection was clearly valued, right? He mentioned men in Saxony whose actual trade was selecting merino sheep, examining them like a connoisseur to pick the absolute best for breeding. The enormous prices given for animals with a good pedigree really highlighted how effective people knew this practice was.
And what's crucial here, Darwin pointed out, is that it wasn't just about obvious big changes. The really important part was the great effect produced by the accumulation of differences absolutely inappreciable by an uneducated eye. These tiny, subtle shifts added up over generations were incredibly powerful.
Which leads to unconscious selection, doesn't it? The idea he thought was maybe even more important for his theory.
Exactly. This is where people simply try to possess and breed from the best individual animals they have without any specific plan to alter the breed overall. Yet, Darwin argued over centuries this process alone would naturally improve and modify any breed, just by consistently favoring the slightly better individuals.
And he found historical hints of this everywhere, didn't he?
Yeah.
From ancient Chinese encyclopedias to Roman classical writers giving explicit rules for selection. Even in societies he termed barbarous, he noted useful animals were likely carefully preserved during famines, which itself is a subtle form of unconscious selection the best survivors get to breed.
So Darwin became convinced that the accumulative action of selection, whether applied methodically and more quickly, or unconsciously and more slowly but efficiently, is by far the predominant power in shaping our domestic animals and plants.
You know, we often think of scientific breakthroughs as these sudden eureka moments, but Darwin really shows us the profound power of patient, sustained observation. Even looking at everyday human practices helped him reveal a fundamental force shaping life. So if this human-driven selection could create such profound changes in domesticated species, Darwin then asked the really critical question: do these same principles, variation and selection, apply out there in the wild, to organic beings in a state of nature?
He confidently said yes. He asserted there is some individual variability in nature, considering it basically undisputed. And these individual differences, he argued, are highly important for us as they afford materials for natural selection to accumulate. That's the raw fuel.
He then jumped into the really thorny problem of defining a species. He pointed out that no one definition has as yet satisfied all naturalists, and often the term carried this hidden baggage, the unknown element of a distinct act of creation.
Right. And variety was almost as tricky to define, though he felt it usually implied some community of descent.
He highlighted examples like polymorphic genera, think brambles, rubus, or rosa, where species show such an inordinate amount of variation that botanists just couldn't agree on which forms were species and which were just varieties.
Yeah, the lines get incredibly blurry. He mentioned being much struck how entirely vague and arbitrary is the distinction between species and varieties when he was comparing birds from the different islands of the Galapagos archipelago and contrasting them with mainland forms. Geographical separation just seemed to amplify this fuzziness.
It makes sense. So ultimately, how did he view this relationship between individuals, varieties, and species?
He saw it as a continuum, individual differences as the first step towards slight varieties, and these varieties as steps leading to more strongly marked and more permanent varieties, and eventually to species. This led to his famous conclusion that a well-marked variety may be justly called an incipient species, basically a species in the process of becoming.
You know, it really highlights how the natural world is far messier than our neat little categories suggest. Darwin showed that trying to classify life actually reveals this continuous spectrum of differences. The label species often feels more like a convenient human invention than a reflection of some fundamental, unchanging essence.
Absolutely. It's a snapshot in time, not a fixed state.
So if variation provides the raw material, what's the engine? What's the relentless force that drives the accumulation of these variations to create distinct species and their exquisite adaptations?
For Darwin, the answer was clear. It follows inevitably from the struggle for life. This constant struggle for life is the principle by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved. He specifically called this process natural selection to draw that clear parallel with the artificial selection practiced by humans.
And he admitted it's easy to grasp intellectually, but hard to keep in mind constantly, didn't he? He said, nothing easier than to admit in words the truth of the universal struggle for life, or more difficult than constantly to bear this conclusion in mind. We see nature looking bright and serene, but we forget the singing birds are eating insects, and they themselves are being hunted.
Exactly. And he used the term struggle for existence very broadly, in a large and metaphorical sense. It included not just direct combat, but also dependence of one being on another, and simply success in leaving progeny. Even a plant on a desert edge battling drought, or one producing thousands of seeds where only one survives to maturity. That's the struggle.
And crucially, he directly linked this to Malthus, right? The doctrine of Malthus applied to the whole animal and vegetable kingdoms, the sheer potential for populations to grow exponentially.
Yes, that high rate at which all organic beings tend to increase was key. It meant that inevitably, a huge number of individuals born must suffer distraction at some point. There just aren't enough resources for unchecked growth.
He gave some incredible calculations to illustrate this. Even the slowest breeder, the elephant, could theoretically produce 50 million elephants descended from the first pair in just 5 centuries if unchecked. The potential growth is mind-boggling, making destruction a mathematical certainty.
And it wasn't just theory. He pointed to real-world examples. The astonishingly rapid increase of various animals in a state of nature when circumstances have been favorable, or how introduced plants could completely take over whole islands in a period of less than 10 years.
Wow. Now, what really struck me was his emphasis on the complex web of complex relations. That example with the bees, mice, and cats, it's fantastic.
Isn't it? Humble bees are vital for fertilizing plants like red clover, but the number of bees depends heavily on field mice, which destroy their nests. And the number of mice, that's largely dependent on the number of cats.
So more cats in a village could indirectly lead to more clover flowers blooming nearby, all through this chain reaction involving mice and bees. It's incredible. It just shows how every organism is tangled up with countless others competing, being prey, being predator, sometimes cooperating.
And he stressed that this struggle almost invariably will be most severe between the individuals of the same species because they need the exact same food, live in the same places, face the same dangers. This intense competition extends right down to varieties of the same species. The best adapted variety will beat the others and so yield more seed, eventually supplanting the others.
It paints a picture of a much more dynamic and, frankly, fiercely competitive web of life than we might initially assume. Every single creature is locked in this constant, intricate struggle, and the ripples spread through entire ecosystems in ways we might never even guess.
Precisely. It's relentless.
Okay, so we have the raw material of variation and this intense struggle for existence providing the pressure. How then does natural selection actually operate to shape life's incredible diversity?
Well, Darwin asked himself, can the principle of selection which we have seen is so potent in the hands of man apply in nature? And his answer was a firm yes. He believed it can act most effectually. This is because variations, even tiny ones, are constantly occurring, and the tendency for traits to be inherited is strong.
And his definition was beautifully simple. This preservation of favorable variations and the rejection of injurious variations I call natural selection. It's a constant sifting process.
And the comparison he draws with human selection is really illuminating. He says, man by selection can certainly produce great results, but natural selection is a power incessantly ready for action and is as immeasurably superior to man's feeble efforts as the works of nature are to those of art.
Why superior? What was his reasoning there?
Because, as he put it, man can act only on external and visible characters. Nature cares nothing for appearances except insofar as they may be useful to any being. Nature, he argued, can act on every internal organ, on every shade of constitutional difference, on the whole machinery of life. Plus, man selects for his own benefit. Nature selects solely for the benefit of the being itself.
That's a powerful distinction. And he gave examples of seemingly minor things being selected for, didn't he? Like camouflage.
Yes, seemingly trifling characteristics. Leaf-eating insects, green and bark feeders, mottled gray. The alpine ptarmigan white in winter, the red grouse, the color of heather. These colors aren't just aesthetic, they are of service in preserving them from danger. Survival advantage.
He also pointed out selection can happen at any stage of life, right? At any age. It could modify seeds, larvae, eggs, or adults. He mentioned things like the specialized jaws some insects have just for opening their cocoon, or the hard tip on a baby bird's beak used only once to break the eggshell. If those single-use tools are vital, selection will favor them.
Absolutely. So the true immense power of natural selection, as Darwin saw it, is its relentless, ongoing scrutiny. It's daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers at the improvement of each organic being.
It's quite a humbling thought, isn't it? While we might pat ourselves on the back for human ingenuity, nature's selective power is infinitely more patient, more precise, more pervasive. It's crafting life with a mastery we're only just beginning to fully appreciate.
It truly is.
So if natural selection is this powerful force, what conditions make it work most effectively? What circumstances are particularly favorable for it to, well, work its magic?
Darwin acknowledged it's an extremely intricate subject.
Okay.
But he did identify some key factors. Obviously, having a large amount of inheritable and diversified variability is favorable, although he stressed that even mere individual differences suffice as starting points. And logically, having a large population, a large number of individuals, helps by increasing the odds that useful variations will actually appear in the first place.
And time, of course, is critical. He emphasized that nature grants vast periods of time for the work of natural selection. But crucially, she does not grant an indefinite period. There's an urgency there, too. If a species doesn't manage to modify and improve in response to changing conditions, it faces extermination, adapt or perish.
He also considered the impact of intercrossing. While free intercrossing will wholly stop a methodical breeder trying to fix a specific trait, he noted that in nature, or even in human unconscious selection, where many people are just breeding from the best available, improvement still happens despite a large amount of crossing with inferior animals. Selection can still push things forward overall.
What about the environment itself? Did the size or nature of the area matter?
Yes, significantly. In a confined or isolated area, like an island, natural selection tends to modify all the individuals in a similar direction. Isolation also is an important element, he argued, partly because it prevents beneficial adaptations from being diluted by interbreeding with outside populations. And importantly, isolation helps by checking the immigration of better adapted organisms after some kind of physical change. This leaves new places open for the old inhabitants to struggle for and become adapted to.
Which helps explain why oceanic islands often have such a very large proportion of endemic species, right? Those unique forms found nowhere else, shaped by their isolated circumstances.
Precisely. But Darwin thought the most favorable scenario for generating lots of truly new forms, forms likely to last and spread, was actually a large continental area which will probably undergo many oscillations of level and which consequently will exist for long periods in a broken condition.
That sounds complex. What did he mean?
He envisioned this grand cycle. You start with the intense competition on a large continent. Then geological subsidence breaks it up into islands. On these islands, isolation allows different populations to modify and diverge locally. Then, renewed elevation reconnects the landmass, throwing these newly modified forms back into severe competition. The most successful varieties spread, driving much extinction of the less improved forms. It's a dynamic engine for diversification and refinement.
Wow, that's a huge vision, linking geology and biology over vast timescales. Islands as evolutionary labs, continents as proving grounds, all unfolding incredibly slowly, almost incomprehensibly slow from our human perspective.
Exactly. He acknowledged natural selection will always act with extreme slowness, often intermittently, but he felt this slow, episodic pace accords perfectly well with what geology tells us of the rate and manner at which the inhabitants of this world have changed.
So as these favored forms increase and spread, what happens to the others?
An inevitable consequence, Darwin concluded, is that the less favored forms decrease and become rare. And as he noted, rarity, as geology tells us, is the precursor to extinction.
It seems unavoidable, doesn't it? If new forms are constantly slowly being produced, then unless the total number of species just keeps increasing indefinitely, which seems unlikely, then older, less adapted forms inevitably must become extinct.
Right, and the ones most vulnerable. He reasoned that rare species will be less quickly modified or improved, and they will consequently be beaten in the race for life by the modified descendants of the commoner species. Furthermore, he argued, the forms which stand in close competition with those undergoing modification and improvement will naturally suffer most.
And who are those closest competitors?
Usually, the most closely allied forms, varieties of the same species and species of the same genus, they have the most similar needs and lifestyles, so each new variety or species during the progress of its formation will generally press hardest on its nearest kindred and tend to exterminate them. It's often the closest relatives that face the fiercest competition from a newly successful form.
He even gave that stark example from livestock breeding in Yorkshire, didn't he?
Yes, how the ancient black cattle were replaced by the longhorns, and then the longhorns were rapidly swept away by the shorthorns, as if by some murderous pestilence. It illustrates how quickly a successful new form can displace its predecessors, even close relatives.
So the natural world isn't some static museum collection. It's this dynamic, constantly churning stage where success for one group often directly leads to the decline and eventual disappearance of another. Progress, in evolutionary terms, seems paved with extinction.
That's a harsh but accurate summary of his view. Extinction is part of the process.
Okay, so we understand how variations accumulate and how competition drives extinction. But how do these slight accumulated differences eventually lead to the much greater differences we see between distinct species? This seems like a key step.
Absolutely. This is where Darwin introduces his principle of divergence of character, which he called, quote, of high importance on my theory. He acknowledged that even strongly marked varieties differ far less than distinct species do. But since he viewed varieties as species in the process of formation, or incipient species, he needed a mechanism to explain how these small differences could become magnified over time.
And he turned back to domestic breeds for insight again, didn't he?
Yes, he painted a picture. Imagine early breeders, some preferring slightly swifter horses, others preferring stronger and more bulky horses. Even if these initial preferences were subtle, continued selection over centuries would cause these early differences to grow. Eventually, you'd get 2 subbreeds and then 2 well-established and distinct breeds. Meanwhile, the inferior animals with intermediate characters would be neglected and would tend to disappear.
So selection actively favors the extremes over the middle ground.
In this scenario, yes. He called this the action of what may be called the principle of divergence, causing differences at first barely appreciable steadily to increase, and the breeds to diverge in character both from each other and from their common parent.
Okay, that makes sense with artificial selection. But how does this apply in nature? Why would nature favor divergence?
He argued, it can and does apply most efficiently from the simple circumstance that the more diversified the descendants from any one species become in structure, constitution, and habits, by so much will they be better enabled to seize on many and widely diversified places in the polity of nature, and so be enabled to increase in numbers. Basically, diversification reduces direct competition. If descendants specialize in slightly different ways, more of them can coexist successfully in the same area.
Did he have evidence for this?
He pointed to agricultural experiments. A plot planted with several distinct genera of grasses consistently yielded a greater number of plants and a greater weight of dry herbage than a similar plot sown with just one species. This suggested that diversity itself allows for greater overall productivity. Therefore, the most distinct varieties of any one species would always have the best chance of succeeding and of increasing in numbers, because they could exploit different resources or niches.
That makes sense. It leads beautifully into his famous tree of life analogy, doesn't it?
It does. He said, the affinities of all the beings of the same class have sometimes been represented by a great tree. I believe the simile largely speaks the truth.
How did he elaborate on that?
He painted a vivid picture. The green and budding twigs may represent existing species, while the branches below represent the long succession of extinct species. And just like vigorous twigs on a real tree branch out on all sides and overtop and kill the surrounding twigs, successful species and groups have tried to overmaster other species in the great battle for life.
So the branching pattern shows relationships, and the dead branches represent extinction.
Exactly. The limbs divided into great branches, and these into lesser and lesser branches were themselves ones, budding twigs. The structure shows lineage. And extinction acts like pruning, constantly shaping the tree, defining and widening the intervals between the several groups that survive.
Wow. The tree of life isn't just a pretty picture, then. It's a really profound conceptual framework. It explains the diversity, the relationships, the extinctions, how subtle differences, amplified by divergence and sculpted by selection over vast periods, lead to the grand branching pattern of life we see.
Precisely. It connects everything.
Now, Darwin was incredibly honest, and he freely admitted that a crowd of difficulties will have occurred to the reader. He even confessed some were so grave that to this day I can never reflect on them without being staggered. What were some of these major hurdles, these grave difficulties that worried him?
Well, a primary one was the apparent lack of innumerable transitional forms in the fossil record and in nature today. If species really descended from others through insensibly fine gradations, why wasn't all nature in confusion instead of the species being, as we see them, well-defined? Where were all the intermediate links?
That's a big one. And another was the sheer complexity of certain organs, right? Like the eye.
Yes, the eye was a classic challenge. He wrote, to suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances, could have been formed by natural selection seems absurd in the highest possible degree. He acknowledged how counterintuitive it felt.
But he didn't stop there, did he? How did he address it?
His reason ultimately trumped his initial intuition. He argued that if numerous gradations from a perfect and complex eye to one very imperfect and simple, each grade being useful to its possessor, can be shown to exist, even just a light-sensitive spot. And if the eye varies and these variations are heritable and useful, then the difficulty, while large, is hardly real. He envisioned evolution working over millions on millions of years. This led to his crucial challenge. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. But I can find out no such case.
That's a bold statement. He also tackled that old saying, natura non facit saltum, nature makes no jump. How did that fit in?
He argued that his theory actually predicted this. Natural selection can act only by taking advantage of slight successive variations. She can never take a leaf, but must advance by the shortest and slowest steps. Gradualism was inherent to the mechanism.
What about instincts? Things like the bee's ability to build perfect hexagonal cells, which have practically anticipated the discoveries of profound mathematicians, as he put it. Or the cuckoo, laying eggs in other birds' nests. How could behavior evolve gradually?
He proposed that even complex instincts could arise through the slow and gradual accumulation of numerous slight yet profitable variations. For the cuckoo, maybe an ancestor just occasionally laid an egg in another nest. If that gave its offspring even a slight advantage, maybe the foster parents were better foragers, this occasional habit could be inherited, favored by selection, and become more refined over generations.
Okay, gradual changes in behavior. But he admitted one difficulty was particularly tough, didn't he? the most serious special difficulty.
Yes, that concerned neuter insects, or sterile females in insect communities, like ants and bees. These workers, or soldiers, often differ widely in instinct and in structure from both the males and fertile females, and yet from being sterile, they cannot propagate their kind. If they don't reproduce, how could natural selection possibly shape their unique traits? It seems like a complete dead end for the theory.
How did he possibly resolve that one?
His solution was brilliant and actually foreshadowed later concepts like kin selection. He argued that selection may be applied to the family as well as to the individual. If a modification in sterile members, like stronger jaws in soldier ants, was advantageous to the community as a whole, then the fertile males and females of the same community flourished and transmitted to their fertile offspring a tendency to produce sterile members having the same modification. Selection acts on the whole colony through the reproductive queen and males.
Wow. So the family unit is the level of selection.
Exactly. He even tackled the climax of the difficulty ant species with multiple distinct castes of sterile workers, like small workers and large soldiers. He noted that even in these cases, you often find individuals that graduate insensibly between the castes, suggesting a continuous pathway for selection to have worked on the fertile ancestors. Darwin actually said that solving this puzzle of the sterile insects, which initially seemed insuperable, ultimately convinced me of the fact of natural selection's power more than almost anything else.
That's fascinating.
Hmm.
He also made a point about seemingly unimportant organs, like the giraffe's tail being used as a fly swatter.
Right. Things that look trivial might actually confer a significant survival advantage in certain environments. Protection from disease-carrying insects could be huge. And importantly, he rejected the idea that every single detail must be useful now. He allowed that many structures are of no direct use, explaining them as inheritance from an ancestor where the structure was useful, like vestigial leg bones in snakes.
And he was clear that selection doesn't produce perfection, right?
Absolutely. Natural selection will not produce absolute perfection, nor do we observe it. He mentioned that even the human eye is said not to be perfect. He felt the wonder indeed is on the theory of natural selection, that more cases of the want of absolute perfection have not been observed. It produces good enough solutions for survival and reproduction, not flawless designs.
His willingness to face these difficulties head on, offering these elegant, often counterintuitive explanations, it really reinforces the strength of his theory, doesn't it? It shows how robust it was, even in the face of apparent contradictions.
It absolutely does. It's a masterclass in scientific reasoning.
Yeah.
So, summing up his core conviction, Darwin stated he was thoroughly convinced that species have changed and are still slowly changing by the preservation and accumulation of successive slight favorable variations.
And he knew this was a radical view, observing that it had been rejected by most eminent living naturalists and geologists.
Yeah.
Why did he think there was such resistance?
He attributed it partly to deeply ingrained beliefs in the immutability of species, partly because many thought the Earth's history was simply too short for such gradual changes, but mostly because, as he insightfully put it, we're always slow in admitting any great change of which we do not see the intermediate step. The lack of obvious transitions was a major psychological barrier.
Which ties back to his point about the fossil record.
Exactly. He stressed that the geological record is far more imperfect than most geologists believe. He compared it not to a well-filled museum, but as a poor collection made at hazard and at rare intervals. We only see tiny, fragmented snapshots of the past.
Looking forward, he predicted his theory would cause a considerable revolution in natural history. How did he see it changing the field?
He believed systematists, the classifiers, would be freed from the shadowy doubt whether this or that form be in essence a species. Those endless disputes whether or not some 50 species of British brambles are true species will cease, because they understand these are just points on a continuum.
And the language used by naturalists would change too.
Yes. Terms like affinity, relationship, morphology, rudimentary organs, they would cease to be metaphorical and will have a plain signification, rooted in common descent. He envisioned a shift in perspective. When we no longer look at an organic being as a savage looks at a ship as something wholly beyond his comprehension, but instead regard every production of nature as one which has had a history, then how far more interesting will the study of natural history become?
So our classifications would become actual genealogies, revealing the plan of creation, not as a static design, but as a historical process. Rudimentary organs would speak infallibly about lost ancestral structures. Embryology would offer glimpses of the prototypes of each great class.
And he made that incredibly bold, almost understated prophecy near the end. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. Just tucked it in there.
Amazing. And he shared his own profound sense of wonder, didn't he? Saying, "When I view all beings not as special creations, but as the lineal descendants of some few beings which lived long before the first bed of the Silurian system was deposited, they seem to me to become ennobled." He even speculated by analogy that probably all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from some one primordial form into which life was first breathed.
That sense of grandeur really culminates in his famous closing passage, reflecting on the, quote, entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the damp earth. He marvels that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other and dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us.
And he lists those laws, doesn't he? Growth with reproduction, inheritance, variability, a ratio of increase so high as to lead to a struggle for life, and as a consequence to natural selection, entailing divergence of character and the extinction of less improved forms. All the pieces we've discussed.
Leading to the powerful conclusion. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows.
And that final, unforgettable sentence. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on, according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. Wow. What an extraordinary deep dive into the very foundations of evolutionary thought. We've really seen how Darwin's, painstaking observations and rigorous logic, from the Galapagos Islands to his humble pigeon loft, built this incredibly powerful theory that explains the breathtaking diversity and intricate connections of life on Earth.
Indeed. It's just a testament to the power of patient observation and critical thinking. It shows us that the mystery of mysteries, as he called it, wasn't solved by some supernatural intervention, but by the ceaseless and often very subtle forces of nature itself, working over immense periods of time.
So maybe next time you look at an entangled bank, or even just, the weeds and insects in your garden, you can remember the profound laws Darwin laid out. That relentless struggle for existence, the slow accumulation of tiny useful variations, and the ever-branching tree of life, constantly evolving.
And maybe consider this. If Darwin is right, if all life truly is connected by this hidden bond of descent, what does that realization mean for our appreciation of every single species, every unique adaptation we see? And indeed, what does it mean for understanding our own place within this grand, dynamic, evolving system?
Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and definitely keep an eye out for those endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful.